All right, so have you guys ever heard a beat or a track that just sounds like it's taking you back in time? Whether if it was actually made in the past or if it was released this year and it just sounds like they're doing something to their tracks or mastering it a certain way that just sounds better, sounds warmer, sounds alive, you know? I've been making beats for half my life now, and I feel like I've come pretty close to cracking the code to getting that warmth sound that I'm looking for. So in this video, I'm gonna walk you through different concepts, ideas, and techniques I like to use to get that warmth sound that I'm looking for in my beats. First things first, you do not need the most expensive plugins. You don't need the newest piece of gear to get that warm vintage sound. All it really comes down to is knowing how to get that sound. So the three effects that I like to use will be saturators, filters, and compressors. Let's start off with saturators. I like to think of saturation as a way to add seasoning to the beat. So just like how you add seasoning to your food, you might add something like some salt, some pepper, some herbs. You can do the same thing with saturation. So depending on what sound you're trying to affect, you can add tape saturation to it. You can add some regular saturation to it. I usually stick to tape saturation just because I feel like it sounds a lot more natural. Some saturator plugins that I like to use will be the J37 by Waves, the Kramer Tape Saturation by Waves, as well as the Oxide Tape Recorder by UAD. Those are the main three plugins that I'm using when I'm trying to get some nice saturation in my beats. But that doesn't mean that I like to just go ahead and drop it on the master channel. What I usually do is drop a saturator on basically every sound in the beat. So every track has a saturator on it 9 times out of 10. And that's because I like to sprinkle in little bits of saturation and different types of saturation on specific types of sounds. So for example, I might like to use the Kramer Tape Saturator on my snare drums because I like the snap that it adds to the snares. I might like to add the J37 to my master channel because it's nice and subtle. And I might like to use the Oxide Tape Recorder on some synths or on a sample just because, you know, every saturator is different. Not only that, but it also adds a little bit of compression to your sound. So you really want to be minimal with this. You know, you want to hear the difference, but you don't want to achieve that warmth just in the first step, you feel me? It's a whole process, all right? So moving on to the next step, we have filters. Now filters, I like to play around with the order. Sometimes I'll put them before the saturator, sometimes I put them after, sometimes I do both. Okay, so something like a snare. Say if you have a snare drum that's hitting really hard, but it has a lot of lower frequencies, and those lower frequencies are triggering the saturation before those higher frequencies. You could just add a low pass filter before the saturator, take out those lows, and now those higher frequencies are going to be affected a little bit better by the saturator. Now when I add filters after the saturator, or whenever I'm adding low pass filters, that's when I'm adding a nice warm blanket over the entire beat. So I'm adding a low pass filter either before or after the saturator. It depends on the sound. You know, every sound is different, but the reason why I'm doing that is because it adds a nice warmth, and not every sound needs to utilize the 18 kilohertz frequency range, the 16 kilohertz frequency range, all the way down to the 10 kilohertz frequency range. Some sounds just do not need to operate that range, and it's really important to create space for sounds that are going to be operating in those frequency ranges, like hi-hats, snare drums, even the distortion sound of the saturation that you add. It could get, you know, kind of cluttered if all the sounds that you have in your beat are occupying the higher frequency ranges in some shape or form. So what I usually like to do is add a low pass filter on the individual tracks of my beat, not on the master channel, but I definitely do like to add a low pass filter on things like my kick drums, even my snare drums. I might add a low pass filter with no resonance or very little resonance around 12 kilohertz, 10 kilohertz, even down to 5 kilohertz. You know, because of me doing that, now my hi-hats have a lot more space to be, you know, snappy, crispy, clean. Or I can add a low pass filter to those and take out something like the 18 kilohertz if I don't want those hi-hats to be super crispy and clean. If I want that lo-fi, boom bap, J Dilla MF Doom sound, you don't want everything to be crispy clean. All right, so I'm here on Ableton and I got this collab beat with me and DB. We got the drum channel in blue. This is what we have for the effects chain. So we have a utility to keep it mono, but then we have F6, which is basically an EQ. I use that in replacement of a filter, of course, because I wanted to go ahead and take out the bass frequencies as well as some of those higher frequencies around 12 kilohertz. After that, we use the Kramer Tape Saturation plugin, as you can see. So let me go ahead and show you guys what these drums sound like without the tape saturation and EQ, and let me go ahead and show you what it sounds like with it. All right, so I'm usually using compressors all throughout the beat, but in this video, the reason why I mentioned it is because you want to make sure that you're using your compressors last, okay? So this is one of the last things you're doing when it comes to adding warmth. You know, you can also add reverb and delays and all that stuff. We're not talking about that in this video. I just want to make sure that you guys understand that I'm not doing something like adding a compressor first, then adding a filter, then adding a saturator. It's just not going to play out the right way, or at least the way that I'm looking for. So feel free to experiment, but usually when I'm compressing my beat, I like to add compression, of course, on, you know, pretty much every track, the drums, the synths, the samples. But on the master channel is where it really counts, because this is where you get your levels right, and this is where you glue together those sounds. And that's when the fruit of your labor kind of starts to show. Things like the saturators, things like the headroom that you were creating, it really just adds a nice depth to your beat if you compress right. The compressor I'm usually using for glue compression is the SSL compressor by Waves. It's a great compressor, it's really versatile, and it sounds really good. So yeah, those are like the three main effects I like to use: saturators, filters, and compressors. Hopefully I explained that good enough for you guys to understand, but there is one more thing that I like to do to my beats to just give it a whole bunch of life, character, and warmth, you feel me? And that's by using cassette tapes, all right? So whether if you're sampling your sample from a cassette tape, or you're passing your sounds through a cassette tape, or you're passing the whole beat through a cassette, usually what I'm doing is I'm passing the whole beat through my cassette and I'm mastering it from there. And the way that I do that is during the mixing phase of my beat making, I like to go ahead, get the mix right, put it on a cassette tape, and look at where the levels are hitting. You might want your levels to be peaking at 0 decibels. You might want it to be peaking at +3. You might even want it to be peaking at +6. So since cassette tapes and cassette decks are entering that entry-level analog goodness, whenever you pass a sound a little bit too hot through the cassette deck, it adds some saturation, some distortion, but it's the good kind of distortion, the kind that sounds good to your ears. So with that information, during the mixing phase of my beat, I like to go ahead and pass it through the cassette deck with the cassette tape, and I like to look at the visuals. Am I going to be hitting at +3? Am I going to be hitting at +6? What do I want to be hitting at these levels? Do I want the kick drum to hit only at +6, or do I want the kick drum and the snare? So those are the things that I'm thinking about, because I understand that depending on what sounds we have hitting, like a kick drum or a snare drum, if those are the only things reaching those levels, those are going to have a nice crunch, a nice fuzz to them. But besides from the pleasant distortion that the cassette deck can add, it also adds that iconic tape hiss, as well as some compression, and it just sounds unique. It does certain things, it's different imperfections that the cassette tape can have that really just sounds good, that you couldn't get, you know. And I understand that there's plugins like RC20 and stuff, but I have RC20 and I have a cassette deck, and I'm gonna be honest, y'all, RC20 just does not give you the same sound. It doesn't give you, it's just not the same sonically, you feel me? It does come close, but it's just not the same. So that's why I saved this technique last, because I feel like this is a step that not every producer is gonna take. This is something that not everybody wants to do. I got my cassette deck for 15 bucks at the thrift store, and I got these cassette tapes for like 15, 20 bucks on Amazon, all right? So it's really not that expensive. It's a lot cheaper than RC20, but I mean, I kind of got lucky with this cassette deck. Now, I mean, if you really want to spend some big money though, and you really want to get some good sounds out of a cassette tape, I would say invest in a proper cassette deck. I'm using a very basic cassette deck. It's not really studio grade or nothing. It's just like a cheap at-home cassette deck. It sounds good enough to me, but I mean, you can go a step further, pay a couple $100 and get something that's actually vintage, that actually is known for producing a nice sound, but that's really up to you. All right, so with all that being said, y'all, that's gonna do it for this video. If you enjoyed this one, make sure you guys like, comment, and subscribe if you're not already. And if you wanna go a step further, make sure you check out my Patreon, where you can get access to exclusive perks like extra videos, piano lessons, beat breakdowns, even extra beats that I just stash, you know, throw them to the side. I post those to Patreon, and 9 times out of 10, a few months later, those beats end up on my beat tapes. So if you guys are interested in just supporting me a little bit further and getting access to a few extra perks, go ahead and check out my Patreon. But with all that being said, you guys, I'm gonna go ahead and get out of here. Peace out.